Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a different kind of darkness. Not the medicated sleeplessness of Kennedy's pharmaceutical nights, not the bright insomnia of modern exhaustion. Tonight we enter the darkness that comes from grief, from melancholy so deep it has no bottom, from responsibility that weighs more than flesh can bear, from the sleepless nights of a man who sent thousands to die and could not rest while they were dying. We're going to spend time with Abraham Lincoln. With the tall, gaunt figure who paced White House corridors while the nation tore itself apart, who walked to the War Department at 3 in the morning to read telegrams from distant battlefields, who aged a decade in 4 years, whose face transformed in photographs from relatively youthful to ancient, who knew darkness intimately and led the nation through its darkest hour. This is not the Lincoln of monuments, not the marble figure carved in stone, not the saint of American mythology. This is the suffering man, the one who could not sleep because sleep felt like abandonment of duty, who walked with melancholy as constant companion, who read letters from mothers whose sons had died and granted pardons to soldiers condemned to execution, who dreamed his own death and walked toward it anyway, who carried burdens that made rest impossible and wakefulness unbearable but necessary. So before you settle in, if you'd like, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something meaningful about exploring these wakeful hours together, finding connection in the shared experience of night and the stories it holds. Now, let the darkness settle around you. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow one last time. Let the sounds of evening wrap you gently. And let's ease into tonight's journey. Into the gaslit corridors where Lincoln walked alone. Into the telegraph office where news of death arrived in clicking code. Into the melancholy that knew no dawn. Into the weight that could not be set down. Into the sleepless nights of the president who saved the Union, but could not save himself from the darkness that lived inside him. Pause. The story we're about to explore is about leadership during crisis. About what it costs to make decisions that determine who lives and who dies, about the particular suffering of those who send others to fight while remaining safely distant. About guilt and grief and responsibility, and the way these accumulate into weight that makes rest impossible. About melancholy, that old word for what we might call depression, and how it shaped the man who would reshape America. Lincoln came to the presidency carrying darkness he had known since youth, had walked with melancholy for decades before the war made that melancholy seem almost prophetic. Almost appropriate. The temperament that made ordinary happiness difficult made extraordinary endurance possible. The sadness that shadowed him prepared him somehow for the role of shepherding a nation through its bloodiest conflict. The sleeplessness that had troubled him for years became absolute during the war years, became the nightly vigil, the constant wakefulness, the consciousness that could not release even when release was desperately needed. We will explore 10 aspects of Lincoln's hidden suffering. 10 chapters in the secret history of a sleepless presidency. We'll begin with the president who walked with shadows the nightly pilgrimages through White House corridors while the nation slept. We'll examine the melancholy that knew no dawn, the constitutional sadness that had followed him since youth. We'll stand in the telegraph office, where night never ended, where news from battlefields arrived in code that meant death counted by thousands. We'll explore the dream that spoke of endings, the prophetic vision of his own death that came in the weeks before Ford's Theater. We'll feel the weight of 10,000 letters, the correspondence from grieving mothers and condemned soldiers that he read personally, late at night, granting mercy when mercy was possible. We'll witness the face that aged before the cameras, the photographs that show visible decline, that document what burden did to flesh. We'll enter the box at Ford's Theater, where rest finally came, the place where his long vigil ended in violence. We'll sit in the room where morning never came, the boarding house where he died through long hours of unconsciousness. We'll understand the melancholy that became memory, how his suffering was preserved, and what it teaches. And finally, we'll reflect on what his story means for leadership, for humanity, for anyone who lies awake carrying burdens that will not release them. This is not a political story, though politics are present. This is not about policy or military strategy or the preservation of union, though these appear. This is a story about what it costs to lead during crisis, about what happens to consciousness when responsibility exceeds human capacity but must be carried anyway. About melancholy that makes some people unable to function and makes others capable of functioning at levels that seem almost superhuman. About the price of sending others to die, about the guilt of surviving while others don't, about all the ways that suffering can be both disabling and somehow enabling. Tonight we will move slowly through Lincoln's darkness. We'll not rush. We'll allow the gaslight to flicker naturally. We'll permit the shadows to deepen at their own pace. We'll explore what it means to walk through nights that bring no rest, to carry burdens that grow heavier rather than lighter, to witness suffering you cannot prevent. To make decisions knowing each choice has consequences measured in lives. These are not just Lincoln's experiences. These are human experiences that his extreme circumstances illuminate for us. So let us begin. Let us enter the White House where gaslight burns in windows that should be dark. Let us walk corridors where a tall figure paces while the Capitol sleeps. Let us stand at windows overlooking the Potomac, where Confederate campfires burn across the water. Let us inhabit the experience of wakefulness that serves not rest but vigilance, of consciousness that cannot release because duty will not permit release, of the president who walked with shadows, who knew darkness intimately, who led through America's darkest hour while carrying his own darkness. The journey begins, the shadows deepen, and somewhere in a house built for governance, a man who cannot sleep begins his nightly walk. The vigil starts, the darkness gathers, and we together will walk through it. We'll understand it, we'll bear witness to the sleepless nights behind the marble monument, to the suffering man behind the sainted memory, to the human behind the myth. Night sounds continue softly, footsteps echoing on wooden floors now. Let us begin. Let us enter the hours when darkness held no rest. In a house built for governance, there was a man who could not rest, who rose from bed while Washington slept and moved through corridors where gaslight flickered against walls that absorbed the weight of a nation tearing itself apart. This was not occasional restlessness, was not the temporary wakefulness that worry sometimes brings, was constant, was nightly, was the pattern that defined his existence during the war years. Abraham Lincoln, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, his body seeming almost spectral in lamplight, would wake at 2 in the morning, sometimes earlier. Sometimes he would not sleep at all, would simply lie in darkness until lying became unbearable, until remaining still felt worse than rising. Then he would dress, would move quietly so as not to wake Mary, would step into corridors where shadows gathered thick as smoke. The White House at this hour held a particular quality of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of sleeping things. The building itself seemed to breathe around him, the old wood settling, the walls contracting slightly as night air cooled them, the small sounds that structures make when human activity ceases and the building returns to its own existence. Lincoln knew these sounds intimately, had learned them through countless nights of waking, of walking, of moving through darkness while everyone else slept. The sounds became companions of sorts, became familiar. Became part of the nightly ritual that had no purpose except to make wakefulness bearable, to give consciousness something to do when consciousness would not release its hold. He would walk from the residence to his office sometimes, would sit at the desk where documents waited, where decisions had to be made, where the work of governance continued regardless of whether the president slept. But often the office felt wrong at this hour, felt too much like duty when what he needed was something else. Something that did not require decision or action or the performance of leadership. So he would walk further, would move through the building simply to move, to inhabit his body in motion when his mind would not stop moving, to create external rhythm when internal rhythm had been lost. It is said that the guards grew accustomed to his presence, that the night staff no longer startled when the tall figure appeared in corridors where they worked, that they understood the president walked when he could not sleep. That they had learned not to intrude, not to offer help that could not help, not to ask questions that had no answers. They simply witnessed, simply saw him pass, simply noted in their logs, if they noted at all, that the president was wakeful, was walking, was moving through darkness that was not just absence of light but presence of something else, something heavier, something that pressed down on consciousness and would not lift even temporarily. Sometimes he would stand at windows, would look out over the grounds toward the city beyond, toward the Potomac visible in moonlight, toward the Virginia hills where Confederate campfires burned like fallen stars scattered across the landscape. The enemy was close, close enough to see their fires, close enough to imagine their soldiers sitting around those flames, close enough to understand that those soldiers were not abstractions, were men like the Union soldiers, were humans who had homes and families and mothers who would mourn them. The fires reminded him that the war was not distant, was not something occurring elsewhere, was here, was constant, was the reality that defined every moment of waking and sleeping, though sleeping had become increasingly rare. Whispers tell us that Lincoln spoke to the portraits sometimes, that late at night, when wakefulness had stretched too long, when the weight of responsibility grew too heavy to carry silently, he would address the previous presidents whose images hung in hallways. Would ask Washington how he had borne the burden of founding, would ask Jefferson how certainty felt because Lincoln himself knew only doubt, would ask Madison about conducting war, would speak aloud questions that had no living person to answer, that could be asked only of the dead, only of those who had gone before and finished their service and been released from the burden of office. The portraits did not answer, just watched with painted eyes, but speaking aloud seemed to help somehow. Seemed to make the burden slightly lighter, seemed to create dialogue where there was only solitary consciousness wrestling with impossible questions. The walking had no destination, had no purpose beyond movement itself, beyond the slight easing that motion brought, beyond occupying the body when the mind could not stop. Left foot, right foot, the length of corridors measured in steps, the building mapped in midnight walks, the architecture learned not through official tour but through sleepless nights. Through the geography of insomnia, through the paths worn by someone who could not rest and so walked instead, mile after mile through rooms and hallways, through the house that should have been home but was only burden made physical, only building that contained the consciousness that could not escape what it knew, what it carried, what it was responsible for. Some nights were worse than others. Some nights the telegrams from the front had brought news of defeats, of battles lost, casualties that exceeded what anyone had expected. On those nights the walking intensified, became less aimless, became almost frantic, though Lincoln's movements remained measured, controlled, presidential even when no one watched. The discipline held. The performance continued even in solitude, but beneath the controlled exterior was urgency, was the need to move faster, to walk harder, to somehow burn through the energy that grief and guilt created, that responsibility generated. That would not dissipate through stillness. Other nights were quieter. The news had been acceptable or there had been no news. The day's decisions had felt sound even if certainty was impossible. On these nights the walking was gentler, was simply the body's refusal to sleep rather than the mind's desperate attempt to escape what could not be escaped, was the familiar insomnia rather than the acute crisis, was the chronic condition rather than the acute attack. These nights he would walk more slowly, would pause at windows longer, would allow himself to simply exist in wakefulness rather than fighting against it, would accept that sleep would not come and make peace with consciousness that continued beyond its natural span. The shadows walked with him. This is what observers noted, that Lincoln seemed always accompanied by darkness that was not just absence of light, that he moved through rooms trailing something that made the air feel heavier, that made his presence feel larger than his already considerable height suggested. The shadows were metaphor perhaps, were the visible manifestation of the melancholy he carried, of the grief that had become his constant state, of the burden that could not be seen directly but was present nonetheless, present in how he moved, how he stood, how his shoulders curved slightly forward as if bearing weight that others could not see. The shadows were real in this sense, not supernatural but psychological. Not ghosts but the visible presence of invisible suffering. Lincoln was not alone in his wakefulness. Elsewhere in Washington, in camps scattered across Virginia, in hospitals where wounded men lay, thousands were awake, were suffering, were dying perhaps. The war continued through night as through day. Battle did not pause for darkness. Suffering did not wait for dawn. Men died at night as they died during day, were afraid at night as they were afraid in daylight. The war was constant, was total. It's the reality that did not release anyone soldier or citizen or president from its grasp. Lincoln's wakefulness was perhaps recognition of this, was perhaps refusal to sleep while others suffered, was perhaps the only way to bear the guilt of being safe while others died, of being comfortable while others froze in trenches, of surviving while thousands did not. Or perhaps the wakefulness was simpler than that, was not noble, was not choice, was simply what his body and mind did now. Had done for so long that rest had become foreign, had become something that happened to other people. Sleep had been difficult for years before the war. The melancholy that shadowed him had always interfered with rest, had always made nights difficult. But the war made what was difficult impossible, made what was chronic absolute, made sleeplessness not occasional but constant, not temporary but the defining feature of his existence. He would return to bed eventually, when dawn approached. When the walking had exhausted him enough that lying down became possible again, when the house began waking and the day staff arrived and the performance would need to resume, he would return to the bedroom where Mary slept or pretended to sleep, would lie down carefully, would close his eyes, would wait to see if the hour or two before official waking might bring some rest. Sometimes it did. Sometimes exhaustion was so complete that consciousness finally released. Sometimes he would sleep briefly, heavily, without dreams, or with dreams so dark he would not speak of them upon waking. Other times he would simply lie there, eyes closed, body still, mind continuing its wakeful working. The problems that had no solutions circling endlessly. The decisions that would need making rehearsed again and again. The consequences of actions already taken reviewed and regretted and somehow accepted because they could not be changed. The staff would find him in the morning, would knock on his door at the appointed hour, would enter to find him already dressed or nearly so, already present in the day though the day had not officially begun. They learned not to comment on his appearance, on the exhaustion visible in his face, on the way his eyes seemed to have retreated further into darkness, on how his clothes hung looser each month as if he were slowly disappearing inside them. They learned to bring coffee, to provide what small comforts were possible, to maintain the routine as if routine could somehow restore normalcy, as if performing normal rhythms could create actual rest. It did not, could not, but the attempt mattered, the care mattered, the recognition unspoken but present that the president suffered, that he needed what they could provide even if what they could provide was inadequate to what he needed. And so the pattern continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the walking through darkness. The standing at windows, the speaking to portraits, the return to bed too late for rest, the rising to face another day of impossible decisions, the accumulation of sleepless nights into exhaustion so profound it became simply his state, his baseline, the condition from which all action proceeded. Lincoln functioned from exhaustion, led from wakefulness, made decisions that affected millions while operating in a state that would disable most people. This was his triumph perhaps, or his tragedy. Or both simultaneously, the fact that he continued, that he functioned, that he led effectively despite conditions that should have made effective leadership impossible. The president who walked with shadows, the man who knew darkness as companion, the consciousness that could not rest walking through nights that offered no rest, through corridors that held only the accumulated weight of decisions made and consequences suffered, through the house that was residence and prison both. Through the wakefulness that had no ending until ending came violently in a theater box on an April evening when vigilance finally ceased, when the walking stopped, when consciousness that had persisted beyond all reason finally was released. But that ending was ahead, was unknown, was coming but not yet arrived. For now the walking continued, the shadows deepened, the gaslight flickered, and somewhere in the White House a tall figure moved through darkness, alone, wakeful, bearing burdens that would not release him. Walking, always walking, through nights that brought no rest, through darkness that had no dawn, through the endless wakefulness that defined his existence. The president, the sufferer, the walker with shadows, forever moving, forever wakeful, forever bearing what could not be borne except through the patient endurance of consciousness that would not stop, that could not stop, that walked through darkness until darkness was all there was, the walking, the shadows, the endless night, all continuing, all enduring. Until they could not continue, until endurance ended, until the walking stopped. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight the walking continues. The shadows gather, and Lincoln moves through them, alone, wakeful, enduring. Before the presidency, before the war, before the nation's crisis became his burden to carry, there was a young man who knew darkness intimately, who had walked with melancholy as his most constant companion since adolescence, who understood from early age that some sadness has no cause that can be named, no event that created it, no logic that explains it, no reason that makes it reasonable, just the weight, just the darkness. Just the presence of something heavy that settles on consciousness and will not lift regardless of circumstance or achievement or the passage of time. Abraham Lincoln knew this darkness long before history knew Abraham Lincoln. It is said that his friends in New Salem worried about him, that in his 20s, living in the small Illinois town where he worked as shopkeeper and postmaster and surveyor, he would sometimes fall into states so dark that they feared for his life. That he spoke openly of death not as something distant, but as something that seemed preferable to the suffering that consciousness brought, that they would watch him, would make sure he was not alone when the darkness grew too complete, would stand vigil over their friend who was being consumed by something they could not see, could not understand, could only witness and try to ease through presence and patience, and the hope that the darkness would eventually lift as it had lifted before. He called it his hypo. Short for hypochondria, though not hypochondria in the modern sense of imagining illnesses. In his era, the word meant something closer to what we would call depression or melancholy, a constitutional condition, a temperamental darkness, a sadness that was not responsive to circumstances but seemed to arise from within, from something in his nature, something that simply was. The hypo would descend without warning, without reason, would settle on him like weather. Would make everything, even pleasant things, even successes, even the company of friends he loved feel gray, feel distant, feel wrapped in gauze that prevented direct experience, prevented genuine feeling, prevented joy from reaching him even when joy should have been present. The melancholy was not constant in those early years, would come and go, would arrive and eventually depart. The departures brought relief, brought return of something like normal functioning. But they brought also the knowledge that the darkness would return, that the melancholy would come again, that the lifting was temporary, that beneath whatever happiness or contentment he managed to feel, the darkness waited, ready to return, ready to consume him again when conditions, or when no particular condition, just the random movement of his temperament permitted its return. Some believe that the melancholy shaped him profoundly, made him who he became. Made him capable of the empathy that his leadership would require, because he knew suffering from inside, knew what it meant to want desperately to stop feeling what you feel, to want escape from your own consciousness, to understand that sometimes simply existing is almost unbearable. This knowledge created in him a gentleness toward human weakness, a patience with suffering, a recognition that people are doing the best they can with the consciousness they have been given. That judgment should be tempered by awareness that we cannot fully know what others experience, what burdens they carry, what darkness shadows them. Whispers tell us that he spoke of it sometimes, that he was unusual among men of his era in being willing to name his sadness, to admit that his inner experience did not match his external circumstances, that he could be objectively successful and subjectively miserable. That achievement did not cure what ailed him. That acclaim did not lift the darkness. That external validation meant little when internal experience remained dark. This honesty was perhaps part of what made people trust him, made them feel he was genuine, made them recognize that the sadness visible in his face was not performance but authentic experience, that he was not pretending to be sorrowful for effect, was simply living with sorrow that would not release him. The melancholy affected everything, affected how he saw the world, how he understood human nature, how he thought about life and death and meaning. It made him philosophical, made him contemplative, made him someone who thought deeply about questions that others might dismiss as unanswerable, about whether life has purpose, about whether suffering serves some function or is simply random misfortune, about whether consciousness is gift or burden, about whether existence justifies its own difficulty or whether non-existence might be preferable. These are not idle questions, are not abstract philosophical puzzles, are questions that people ask when the burden of consciousness becomes almost too heavy to bear, when simply being awake feels exhausting, when you understand viscerally that existence requires effort, requires choosing to continue when continuation brings only more of what has already proven difficult. The darkness made some things impossible, made ordinary happiness elusive, made the simple pleasures that others took for granted feel distant. Feel like experiences happening to someone else, feel wrapped in the gauze that prevented direct feeling. But the darkness made other things possible, made endurance possible, made the ability to continue functioning while suffering possible, made the capacity to work through pain possible, made the strength to bear burdens that would break those who had never known sustained suffering possible. The melancholy was disability in some senses, made normal life difficult, made simple joy almost impossible. But it was also strange preparation, strange training, strange development of capacities that would prove essential when crisis demanded more than human beings ordinarily have to give. He married, built a life, practiced law, entered politics. The melancholy did not prevent functioning, did not disable him in ways that made normal life impossible. It simply made everything harder, made every day require more effort, made simple tasks feel weighted, made achievement feel less satisfying, made success feel somehow hollow. But he continued working, continued building, continued moving forward through the darkness that shadowed every step. The continuing itself became his response to the melancholy. The refusal to stop became his resistance. The determination to function despite the darkness became his defiance. Not dramatic defiance, not heroic resistance, just the daily, patient, undramatic continuation. The getting up, the going to work, the doing what needed doing. The small accumulation of days that added up to life, to career, to achievement that mattered even if it did not bring the happiness that achievement was supposed to bring. By the time he reached the presidency, the melancholy was so much a part of him that separating Lincoln from his sadness was impossible. They were unified, were single entity. He was the man who carried darkness, was the person whose baseline state included weight that others did not carry, was the consciousness that knew intimately what others experienced only occasionally. His humor was defense against the darkness, the jokes and stories that he told constantly, the laughter that erupted from him at odd moments, the need to create lightness because light did not come naturally, did not arise spontaneously, had to be generated, had to be created deliberately as counterweight to the darkness that was always present. And then the war came, brought darkness that matched his internal darkness, brought external sorrow that reflected internal sorrow, brought suffering on scale that made his personal suffering seem almost trivial, almost appropriate, almost like preparation for this moment, for this role, for shepherding nation through crisis that would require someone who knew darkness, who understood suffering, who could bear the unbearable because he had been bearing it privately for decades. The war made his melancholy visible, made it seem responsive to circumstances, made it appear that he was sad because of the war when the truth was more complex, was that he had always been sad, and the war made that sadness seem reasonable, made it fit circumstances, made internal experience and external reality align in ways they had not aligned before. The sleeplessness intensified. The melancholy that had interfered with rest for years made rest impossible during war years. The darkness that had made nights difficult made nights unbearable. The weight that had always pressed on consciousness became crushing, became almost more than consciousness could bear, almost but not quite. Not quite because he continued, because consciousness persisted, because the will to function survived even when the desire to continue did not. This is perhaps the definition of melancholy, not the absence of will to live, but the presence of will despite absence of desire. The continuation not because continuing seems worthwhile, but because stopping seems wrong. Seems like abandonment, seems like betrayal of those who depend on your continuing. His wife Mary understood some of it, had her own struggles with what her era called nervous troubles, had her own experience of consciousness that would not quiet, of emotions that exceeded what circumstances warranted, of suffering that seemed disproportionate to cause. They understood each other in this way. Both knew what it meant to be at war with your own mind, to be betrayed by your own emotions, to experience your consciousness as sometimes enemy rather than ally. This shared understanding created bond, created patience between them even when other aspects of relationship were difficult. created recognition that they both fought battles that others could not see, could not understand, could witness only through effects rather than causes. Some believed that Lincoln's melancholy made him better president during crisis, made him capable of bearing what needed bearing, made him patient with slow progress because he understood that some struggles have no quick resolution, made him willing to endure because endurance was what he knew, was what he had practiced daily for decades, made him capable of making decisions that would haunt him because he already lived with haunting, already carried ghosts, already knew what it meant to be pursued by thoughts that would not release you, by consequences that consciousness could not escape, by responsibility that sleep would not relieve. Melancholy was curse and preparation both, was disability that somehow enabled, was suffering that created capacity for bearing more suffering. The darkness knew no dawn. This was the truth of melancholy, that it did not lift permanently, that even when circumstances improved, when battles were won, when progress was made, the internal darkness remained constant, remained the baseline from which all experience emerged. The darkness was home, was familiar. Was the state that consciousness returned to regardless of what happened externally. This is what those who have not experienced melancholy often fail to understand, that it is not responsive to circumstances in normal ways, that good news does not cure it, that success does not lift it, that love does not dissolve it, that it simply is, simply persists, simply waits beneath whatever temporary reprieve events might provide. The darkness was Lincoln's constant companion. More constant than any human companion, more faithful than any friend, more persistent than any enemy. The darkness walked with him, shadowed him, made him who he was, made him capable of what he achieved, made him suffer even in triumph, made him melancholy even in victory. The darkness knew no dawn, knew only persistence, knew only the patient presence that outlasts everything else, that remains when joy fades, that waits when happiness passes, that is there always. The melancholy, the darkness. The wait forever present, forever shadowing, forever making the simplest things difficult and the most difficult things somehow possible. The melancholy shaped him, defined him, made him capable of leading through darkness because he knew darkness from inside, knew it intimately, knew it as he knew his own reflection. The darkness that knew no dawn, the melancholy that preceded the war and outlasted it, the weight that consciousness carried through every moment, through every decision, through every night of walking. Through every morning of rising, through all of it, the darkness endured, and Lincoln endured, both together, both inseparable, both real, forever. There was a room where Lincoln went when sleep abandoned him, when lying in bed became unbearable, when the thoughts that circled through his mind needed distraction, needed focus, needed something beyond the endless internal conversation that wakefulness brought. The room was in the War Department, connected by telegraph wires to distant battlefields, to generals commanding armies, to outposts where news arrived before it reached the wider world. To the places where his decisions became actions measured in casualties, where strategy became suffering, where orders became death. The telegraph office became his refuge, his place of pilgrimage in hours when the White House felt too large and too small simultaneously, too empty of purpose and too full of ghosts, too silent and too loud with thoughts that would not quiet. He would rise from bed at 2 in the morning sometimes earlier, sometimes he would not sleep at all. Would lie for hours attempting rest that would not come, would finally accept that the night would be spent wakeful, would dress quietly so as not to disturb Mary, would step into corridors where gaslight burned low, where shadows gathered thick, would walk from the executive mansion across the grounds toward the War Department. The walk was brief, was perhaps 5 minutes of movement through darkness, but it served purpose, created transition, marked passage from private suffering to public duty. From the man who could not sleep to the president who came to check on the war that never slept, the night air helped somehow. The movement helped. The sense of purpose, however small, however inadequate, helped make the wakefulness bearable, made it feel slightly less like torture and slightly more like vigilance, like duty, like the reasonable response to responsibility that exceeded human capacity but had to be carried by humans anyway. The War Department building stood solid in darkness. Stood present, stood awake in the sleeping city. Inside, telegraph operators worked in shifts so someone was always present, always receiving messages, always translating the clicks and pauses into words that meant victory or defeat, advance or retreat, casualties that numbered in hundreds or thousands. The operators grew accustomed to Lincoln's visits, learned to expect the tall figure appearing in their doorway at hours when the president should be sleeping, learned not to startle. Not to make a fuss, not to treat his arrival as anything unusual. They would simply acknowledge him, would gesture to the chair he had claimed as his own, would continue their work while he sat and waited for messages that might come, waited for news that would change something or confirm something or simply fill the hours that consciousness insisted on enduring. It is said that the telegraph operators respected his presence, that they understood he was not checking on them, was not supervising, was simply unable to be elsewhere, that his coming was not duty but need, not surveillance but seeking, Seeking what? Not comfort exactly, not reassurance, perhaps simply connection, simply the reminder that others were awake too, that the war continued through night as through day, that he was not alone in his vigil even if his vigil felt profoundly solitary. The clicking of the telegraph keys provided rhythm, provided sound that was not silence, provided evidence that communication was happening, that information was moving, that the vast machinery of war, however terrible, however costly, was at least functioning, at least doing what it was designed to do, even if what it was designed to do was killing on scale previously unimaginable. The office was small, was cramped, was not designed for presidential visits, was simply workspace for operators who managed the communications that war required, but Lincoln made it his own. Claimed the wooden chair near the main telegraph station, would sit for hours sometimes, would read dispatches as they arrived, would watch the operator's hands translating code into English, would see the words appear on paper in real time, unfiltered, uninterpreted, simply the raw information arriving from generals and colonels and captains who were managing the actual fighting while he managed the abstraction called strategy. The distance between his chair in the telegraph office and the battlefields where men died was vast, was unbridgeable, but the telegraph closed it slightly, made the war feel slightly less distant, slightly more real, slightly more immediate than reports that arrived hours or days late, already history by the time he read them. Whispers tell us that Lincoln memorized the code, learned to read the clicks directly, could understand the messages before the operator translated them. This made the waiting slightly easier, made him less dependent, less passive, allowed him to participate however slightly in the communication, to be not just receiver of information but reader of raw data. The skill was small, was perhaps unnecessary, but it mattered to him, mattered to feel less helpless, mattered to have some direct connection to the information, some way to bypass intermediaries and access truth directly, however much truth could be accessed from 500 miles away. However much reality could be captured in clicks and dashes and the brief messages that telegraph technology allowed. The messages came at all hours. The war did not pause for darkness, did not rest because humans needed rest, continued its relentless progress through night as through day. A battle report from Tennessee, casualties from Virginia, a question from a general in Missouri needing clarification of orders, an update from a supply officer managing logistics of feeding armies. The messages were various, were sometimes crucial and sometimes routine, but all carried weight, all mattered because all were part of the vast coordination required to conduct war on this scale. All contributed to the effort that Lincoln directed from his chair in the cramped office, from his position so far from actual fighting, so safe while others died, so comfortable while others froze in trenches. The guilt of this distance was perhaps part of why he came. Why he sat through hours of darkness watching messages arrive, why he made himself witness to the war's continuation, why he refused to sleep while the war kept waking. Sometimes messages arrived that demanded immediate response, a general requesting permission for an action, a crisis developing that required presidential decision. These moments brought focus, brought the sharp clarity that crisis provides, brought Lincoln fully into the present because the present demanded his attention, demanded decision. Demanded that he be president rather than simply man who could not sleep. He would read the message, would consider, would draft response, would give it to the operator to send, would watch the message being transmitted, knowing that in minutes or hours, depending on distance and relay stations, his words would reach the recipient, would affect what happened, would change outcomes, would determine actions that would determine fates. The weight of this was enormous, was almost crushing, but it was also clarifying. It was a reminder that his wakefulness had purpose, that the vigil served function, that consciousness that would not release him was consciousness that the nation needed awake, needed alert, needed ready to respond. Other times, most times, the messages required no response, were simply information arriving, updates on situations already in motion, reports of actions already completed, notifications of outcomes already determined. These Lincoln would read and absorb and carry. Would add to the accumulated knowledge he bore, would incorporate into the mental map he maintained of the war's vast geography, of the multiple theaters, of the hundreds of thousands of men in motion, of the logistics and strategy and the human cost of every decision made and action taken. The information was burden, was weight added to weight already carried, but it was necessary burden, was the cost of command, was what responsibility meant that you know, that you witness. That you bear the knowledge of what your decisions create. The silence between messages was sometimes harder than the messages themselves. The moments when the telegraph was quiet and Lincoln would sit in lamplight with nothing to occupy consciousness except the thoughts that had driven him from bed, the consequences that consciousness insisted on reviewing, the decisions that could not be unmade, the costs that could not be avoided, the guilt that had no resolution because the war required continuation. Required more sacrifice, required sending more men to die. In these silences, the weight became almost unbearable, became the full presence of responsibility without the distraction of immediate crisis, became simply sitting with knowledge of what was, what had been done, what would need to be done, what could not be avoided or evaded or escaped through any action or decision or strategy. The operators would sometimes try to ease the silence, would offer coffee, would make small conversation, would share jokes or stories from the messages they received, the human moments that appeared sometimes in military communications, the evidence that soldiers remained human despite the machinery of war. Lincoln appreciated this, would laugh when laughter was appropriate, would engage when engagement was possible, would accept the kindness that the operators offered through their presence and their willingness to share the vigil. The camaraderie was limited, was constrained by rank and role and the formality that even wartime required, but it was real, was genuine connection between people who were awake while the world slept, who witnessed together the war's continuation, who sat in small room reading messages that meant death and defeat and victory measured in costs that exceeded what anyone had anticipated when the war began. Dawn would come eventually, would arrive as it always arrived, would touch windows with light that meant the night's vigil was ending. That the day's work would begin, that Lincoln would need to return to the White House, would need to prepare for the official schedule, would need to resume the presidential performance, would need to be Lincoln the President rather than Lincoln Themenhockadnotsleep. He would rise from the chair that had held him through the night, would thank the operators, would walk back across the grounds that were no longer dark, would return to the building where day staff would soon arrive, where the machinery of governance would resume, where decisions would be made in offices and meetings rather than in cramped telegraph room in the early hours. But before leaving, he would often pause, would stand in the doorway looking back at the small room, at the chair where he had sat, at the telegraph station where news arrived, at the space that had held him through another sleepless night. The office had become sacred to him, not sacred in religious sense, but sacred as places become sacred when they witness suffering, when they hold consciousness through difficult hours, when they provide the small comfort of purpose, of connection, of awareness that others are awake too, that the burden is shared even when it feels utterly solitary, that the vigil continues, that the night ends, that morning comes even when morning brings no rest, just another day, just continuation, just more of what could not be changed but somehow had to be born. The telegraph office where night never ended, where the war continued regardless of hour, where Lincoln came seeking what sleep could not provide, seeking connection to the reality that his decisions created, seeking witness to the cost, seeking perhaps penance for the guilt of surviving while others died, for commanding while others obeyed, for the distance that separated him from the suffering that his leadership required. The office held him, held his vigil, held the weight he carried, through countless nights, through hours that accumulated into something that was both historical record and personal suffering, both the conduct of war and the private wrestling with what that conduct cost. The office remembered, the operators remembered, the messages arrived, the night continued, and Lincoln sat in his chair, reading, witnessing, bearing, the vigil that had no ending except the ending that came in April, that came violently, that finally released him from the need to be awake, from the responsibility to witness, from the burden that the telegraph office helped him carry, from the night that never ended except through ending that ended everything. The office stands in memory, holds still the image of the tall figure sitting in lamplight, reading messages that meant death, bearing witness to war that never slept, the president who came to the place where night never ended, who sat through darkness, who carried what had to be carried, who endured what had to be endured, until he could not endure longer. Until the vigil stopped, until the night finally ended, the telegraph office, the chair, the messages, the vigil, all remembered, all testimony, all preserved as evidence of what was born, what was witnessed, what was carried through darkness, forever. Due to length constraints, I'll continue with the remaining chapters. Would you like me to continue with chapter 4 and the rest? It is said that Lincoln dreamed his death, not once but multiple times in the final weeks. That is sleep when sleep finally came, when consciousness finally released its exhausted hold, brought visions that felt different from ordinary dreams, felt heavier, felt weighted with significance that ordinary dreams do not carry, felt like messages arriving from somewhere beyond the normal workings of the sleeping mind, like warnings, like prophecy, like knowledge that should not be possible but was present anyway. He spoke of these dreams to those close to him, to his wife, to his cabinet members, to friends who visited in the evening hours, spoke not casually but with the gravity of someone who believed what he had seen, who understood that the dreams meant something, who carried the weight of foreknowledge even if he did not fully trust it, even if he could not be certain whether the dreams were genuine prophecy or simply his mind processing the accumulated threats, the assassination attempts that had already occurred, the hatred that was visible in certain quarters, the knowledge that leading during Civil War made him target, made him someone whose death some people actively desired. The most famous dream came in early April 1865, days before Ford's Theater, after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. After the war's ending seemed assured, After the burden that had defined 4 years was finally lifting. After Lincoln could imagine future that included something other than war, other than death counts, other than the nightly telegrams bringing news of casualties. The dream came in this moment of relative peace, of relative hope, of the beginning of relief. Perhaps this timing made the dream more disturbing, made it feel more like interruption of happiness than simply continuation of suffering. Made it seem cruel that just as life might improve, the dream suggested life would end. He described the dream to several people. The accounts vary slightly in detail but are consistent in essence, in structure, in the emotional content that made the dream significant. He dreamed he was in the White House, in the residence. At night, he heard weeping, heard the sound of mourning, heard grief so profound it filled the building. He rose from bed in the dream and followed the sound. Walked through corridors he knew intimately, moved toward the source of the weeping, found rooms filled with people dressed in black, found mourners gathered, found evidence everywhere of death, of loss, of catastrophe. He walked through the East Room, the large formal space where receptions were held, where state functions occurred, where the public life of the presidency was conducted. But in the dream, the room was transformed, was filled with mourners, was holding a body laid out in state, was serving as space for viewing. For paying respects, for the rituals that death requires, a catafalque stood in the center, the platform that holds a coffin, draped in black, surrounded by flowers, guarded by soldiers standing at attention. The weeping came from people filing past, from citizens who had come to mourn, to witness, to pay respect to whoever lay there. Lincoln approached in the dream, moved through the crowd, moved toward the catafalque, wanted to see who had died, who was being mourned, who had created this profound grief that filled the White House. He reached the platform, looked at the figure laid out there, saw the face covered, saw only the body shrouded, could not identify who this was, could not determine whose death had created such response, such gathering, such grief. So he turned to one of the guards, one of the soldiers standing vigil, asked directly, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier turned toward him, answered with words that Lincoln would remember upon waking, would haunt him through the remaining days. The soldier said, "The president, he was killed by an assassin." And Lincoln woke suddenly, woke with the dream vivid, with the image of the catafalque clear in memory, with the soldier's words echoing, with the knowledge or the feeling of knowledge that the dream meant something, was not simply mind processing information, was not random neurons firing during sleep, was something else, something that felt like message, like warning, like vision of what was coming. He lay in darkness after waking, lay still while his heart gradually slowed, while consciousness returned fully, while he transitioned from the dream state to waking state. But the dream did not fade as dreams usually fade, did not blur into vague impressions, remained clear, remained present, remained disturbing in ways that made him speak of it, made him describe it to others, made him seek perhaps reassurance that it was only dream, only the mind's imaginings. Only fear made manifest in sleep rather than genuine prophecy. But he did not seem reassured when others dismissed the dream, when they told him it was simply anxiety, simply stress, simply the mind processing the known threats. He listened to their explanations, accepted their attempts at comfort, but something in him seemed to recognize the dream's truth, seemed to understand that what sleep had shown him was not warning that could be heeded, but knowledge that could only be carried. That the dream was not telling him something that could be prevented, but something that would occur. That consciousness had been granted foreknowledge not as opportunity to change outcomes, but as preparation for what was inevitable. Whispers tell us that the dream changed something in him, that after describing it, after speaking the vision aloud, something shifted. Some quality of resignation settled into his demeanor, not despair exactly, not giving up, but acceptance perhaps. Recognition that his time was short, that the war he had managed to end would also end him, that he would not live to see the reconstruction, would not guide the healing, would not finish what he had started. The dream made explicit what perhaps he had already suspected, what the accumulated assassination attempts had suggested, what the hatred visible in certain quarters had indicated, that he would not survive his presidency, would not return to Illinois, would not retire to private life, would not grow old. The dream showed him what was coming, and having seen, he continued anyway, continued functioning, continued leading, continued making plans for reconstruction even while carrying knowledge or belief in knowledge that he would not be there to implement those plans. Some believe the dream was genuine prophecy, was actual foreknowledge granted through sleep, through the mechanisms of dreaming that remain mysterious, that perhaps allow consciousness to access information normally unavailable, to perceive patterns in ways that waking mind cannot, to know futures that have not yet occurred but are approaching with inevitability that makes them knowable to consciousness operating in altered state. The dream as psychic phenomenon, as supernatural event, as genuine vision of future granted to someone whose role required knowing even when knowing brought only suffering. This interpretation grants the dream power, grants it significance beyond psychology, makes it sacred in sense of being communication from source beyond individual consciousness. Others believe the dream was simply mind processing information, Was Lincoln's consciousness working through the known threats, through the attempts that had already been made, through the hatred that letters brought daily, through the knowledge that presidents could be killed, previous attempts had been made, other leaders had been assassinated. The possibility was real and present. The dream was pattern recognition. Was the mind seeing clearly what waking consciousness tried to deny? Was psychological rather than supernatural? Was human rather than divine? But no less significant, no less true, no less prophetic, even if the mechanism was entirely natural. Even if the dream was simply mind doing what minds do, processing, analyzing, predicting based on available information. The truth of the dream's mechanism matters less than the truth of the dream's content. Whether supernatural or natural, whether prophecy or prediction, the dream proved accurate. What Lincoln saw in sleep became reality in waking. The catafalque in the East Room, the mourners filing past, the body laid out in state, the president killed by assassin. All of it occurred, all of it became history. The dream was true regardless of how it was true, was prophetic regardless of whether the prophecy came from divine source or human psychology. The accuracy is what matters. Fact that Lincoln dreamed what would occur, that he knew or believed he knew that his ending was approaching, that he carried this knowledge through the final days, through the final week, through the final evening when he dressed for the theater, when he sat in the box, when he watched the play, when the dream's prophecy was fulfilled. What does it mean to dream your death? What does it mean to receive such knowledge and continue living? To make plans knowing the plans will not be completed, to speak of future knowing you will not see it. To function normally while carrying abnormal foreknowledge. This is the mystery the dream creates. This is what Lincoln's final days were shaped by. The knowledge, true or false, supernatural or psychological, that time was short, that ending was approaching, that the work would not be finished, that the story would end mid-sentence, that he would be taken before completion, before rest, before the reward that endurance was supposed to bring. The dream told him this, and he accepted it, carried it, continued anyway. Went to the theater anyway, sat in the box anyway, made himself available to the ending that the dream had shown him, whether because he believed resistance was futile, whether because duty required continuing regardless of risk, whether because he was simply exhausted enough that ending seemed acceptable, seemed almost welcome, seemed like release from burden that had grown unbearable. The dream spoke, he listened, he continued, the prophecy approached, and Lincoln walked toward it. Carrying the knowledge that sleep had given him, carrying the vision that consciousness had received, carrying the weight of foreknowledge, until the dream became reality, until the vision proved true, until the ending that sleep had shown him arrived, and consciousness that had dreamed its ending ended, the dream that spoke of endings, the vision that proved accurate, the prophecy fulfilled, the knowledge granted, the burden carried, the ending accepted, all held in the dream, all known before occurring. All carried by consciousness that would not rest, that could not escape, that knew and continued knowing, until knowing ended, until the dream concluded, until sleep became permanent, until consciousness that had been granted foreknowledge was released from the burden of knowing. The dream, the prophecy, the ending, all held together, all true, forever. Every day they arrived, in mail bags carried from the post office, in pouches delivered by courier, in the constant stream of correspondence that the presidency generated. Letters from citizens, from soldiers, from mothers, from wives, from the grieving and the desperate and the hopeful, from people who believed that writing to the president might change something, might help, might bring relief or mercy or simply acknowledgement. Letters asking for pardons, for intervention, for explanations. Consolation, for the president to know their stories, to witness their suffering, to carry their grief however briefly. Lincoln read them, read more than he should have, more than advisors recommended, more than was reasonable given the demands on his time. Read them because not reading felt like abandoning those who had reached out, like hiding from the consequences of his decisions, like pretending the war was abstract when every letter testified to its terrible specificity, its individual costs. Its personal devastations. The letters came from everywhere, from every state, from both Union and Confederate territories, from camps and hospitals and homes, from battlefields and prisons and towns occupied by one army or another. The geographic distribution testified to how completely the war had spread, how it touched every corner of the divided nation, how no place remained untouched, no family unaffected. No life unchanged by the conflict that had begun 4 years earlier and consumed more than anyone had anticipated when it started. The letters were evidence, were documentation, were the human face of statistics that measured casualties in thousands, that tallied dead and wounded with numbers that numbed consciousness because consciousness could not hold grief on that scale, could not mourn hundreds of thousands individually, but the letters made individual cases visible, made single stories matter. Made the war personal in ways that reports never could. Some letters came from mothers, women whose sons had enlisted or been conscripted, who had sent their children to war and received back only notification of death, or worse, received back wounded sons, changed sons, sons who had survived physically but were damaged in ways that would never heal. The mothers wrote asking Lincoln to understand what the war had cost them, what it continued costing. They were not always accusatory, some were. Some blamed him directly, held him responsible for their sons' deaths, called him murderer, called his war unjust, called for his own death as payment for deaths he had caused. But others were gentler, were simply sharing their grief, were asking him to know, to carry the knowledge of what his decisions had created, to understand that every casualty count included sons, included children who had been loved, who had been raised with care, who represented years of a mother's life invested in bringing them to adulthood, all lost, all gone, all sacrificed to the war that Lincoln led. Other letters came from soldiers themselves, men writing from camps or hospitals, writing sometimes to thank him, to express support for the war, to assure him their sacrifice was willing, that they believed in the cause that they were proud to serve. These letters were comfort, were evidence that the suffering had meaning, that men understood what they fought for. That the war was not simply Lincoln's decision imposed on unwilling population, but genuine conflict over principles that men believed worth dying for. These letters he treasured, would keep some in his desk, would return to them when doubt became overwhelming, when the weight of responsibility made him question whether the war should continue, whether preservation of Union was worth the cost in lives. The soldiers' letters testified that they believed it was, that they chose to fight. That their deaths, if death came, would be sacrifice made knowingly rather than waste imposed by leaders safe in Washington. But not all soldier letters were supportive. Some were desperate pleas, men writing from military prisons where they awaited execution for desertion, for cowardice, for refusing to fight, for running from battle, for all the ways that human fear could express itself when confronted with death. These men asked for clemency, asked for mercy, asked Lincoln to understand that they had been afraid, that they had families depending on them, that they had not understood what war would be like when they enlisted, that they wanted to go home, that they could not continue, that they would rather die than continue fighting but did not want to die by firing squad, did not want to die branded as cowards. These letters were hardest to read, were the ones that kept him awake after reading. That made him return to his office late at night to review the cases again, to determine whether mercy was possible, whether military discipline allowed for forgiveness, whether sparing one man would undermine the Army's functioning, whether killing him served purposes sufficient to justify killing. Lincoln granted many pardons, was known for this, was famous among soldiers for his willingness to intervene, to override court-martial decisions, to spare men condemned to death. He could not spare all of them. Military necessity required some executions, required that desertion carry consequences, required that soldiers know running was not option, that duty must be fulfilled, that the Army would function only if discipline was maintained. But he spared those he could, found reasons to grant mercy, found loopholes in regulations, found ways to commute death sentences to prison terms, found ways to give men second chances. His advisors worried about this, worried that mercy would be mistaken for weakness, that soldiers would think they could desert without consequence, that the Army's effectiveness would deteriorate if discipline became inconsistent. But Lincoln could not stop himself, could not read letters from terrified young men and simply let them die when he had power to prevent it. The reading happened late at night, after official work was complete, after dinner, after the evening hours when visitors came and meetings were held. Lincoln would retire to his office with a stack of letters, would light lamps, would settle into his chair, would read one after another, slowly, carefully, giving each his full attention, trying to understand each story, each situation, each request. The reading took hours, would extend past midnight sometimes, would keep him wakeful when wakefulness was already his constant state, but he persisted, could not stop, could not delegate this work to others, could not trust that someone else would give the letters the attention they deserved, the care they required, the respect they demanded. Whispers tell us that he wept sometimes while reading, that the accumulated grief became too much, that consciousness could hold only so much suffering before requiring release, that tears came not from weakness but from full recognition of what the letters contained, what they represented. The tears were private, were his alone. No one witnessed them except perhaps the ghosts that inhabited the building, the presence of previous presidents who had also struggled with burden, the weight of office that persisted regardless of who occupied it. The tears were acknowledgement, were the body's response when the mind could no longer process what it was receiving, when emotion exceeded what consciousness could contain, when grief demanded physical expression because mental holding was no longer sufficient. Some letters he answered personally, would draft responses in his own hand, would send them signed with his name, would take the time that such correspondence required even when time was the resource he lacked most. The answers were brief usually, were acknowledgments that the letter had been received and read, were expressions of sympathy that sorrow had occurred, were explanations as much as could be explained of why certain decisions had been made, why the war continued, why mercy could not always be granted, why loss had to be borne. The answers could not undo what had been done, could not restore sons to mothers, could not bring back the dead, could not erase suffering, but they testified to witness, to acknowledgement, to the fact that someone had seen, had read, had carried briefly the burden of individual grief. The letters accumulated, were filed, were preserved, were part of the permanent record that the presidency generated. Later historians would examine them, would catalog them, would use them as sources for understanding the war, for documenting its human cost, for recovering individual stories from the mass of statistics. But for Lincoln, the letters were not historical documents, were not sources for future scholarship, were immediate reality, were present suffering, were the weight that consciousness carried through every moment, every decision, every sleepless night when the letters he had read would return, would replay in memory, would demand attention that could not be given during daylight but that darkness made impossible to avoid. The guilt was profound. Was perhaps the heaviest burden the letters created, the guilt of surviving while others died, of being safe while others suffered, of making decisions from comfort while others endured consequences in mud and cold and fear, the guilt of having power to help some but not all, of granting mercy to certain individuals while the war's machinery continued grinding thousands to death. The guilt of being responsible, however complexly, however shared the responsibility was with others for the suffering that every letter documented, for the death, for the grief, for all the accumulated cost that 4 years of war had created. The guilt had no resolution, had no absolution, had only acceptance, had only the recognition that this was cost of leadership, this was burden of command, this was price of preserving union. The guilt was earned, was deserved, was appropriate response to role he had accepted, to decisions he had made, to war he had chosen to wage. The letters testified, he witnessed, the weight accumulated, the burden grew, the guilt persisted, and Lincoln carried it, carried all of it, through every letter read, through every pardon granted or denied, through every night of sleeplessness when the letters came back to haunt, when the faces he imagined behind the words would appear in darkness, when the grief would be his to carry because he had chosen to read, had chosen to witness, had chosen to bear the burden of knowing, the weight of 10,000 letters, 10,000 stories, 10,000 griefs, all carried, all held, all borne through darkness that letters had helped create, that reading had intensified, that knowledge had made heavier, the weight, the burden, the accumulated grief, all pressing down, all making rest impossible, all making sleep impossible, all making peace impossible, all carried forever. There are photographs taken across 4 years, taken by photographers who came to document the president, who captured what the camera could see, what long exposures revealed, what the face showed when performance paused long enough for light to etch image onto glass plates coated with chemicals that would preserve the moment, preserve the truth that the face could not hide when stillness was required, when the body had to remain motionless for seconds that felt like minutes, when the mask that performance created had to relax because maintaining it during exposure was impossible. The photographs tell a story that speeches might obscure, that official reports might deny, that Lincoln himself might have wanted hidden. They tell it in lines that deepen, in eyes that retreat into shadow, in cheeks that hollow, in the visible transformation from Manoy's president to Manoy's consummate presidency. Place them side by side. The photograph from March 1861 and the photograph from February 1865. 4 years separating them, only 4 years, 48 months, one presidential term. The span of time is not long in ordinary life, is not enough for dramatic aging under normal circumstances. A man of 52 becoming 56 should show some change, some graying perhaps, some additional lines around eyes and mouth, but not transformation. Not the shift from one state of being to something almost unrecognizable, not the change that makes people who knew him remark that he seems decades older, that he has been hollowed out, that something essential has been consumed by whatever he has endured. But Lincoln's face in 1865 shows exactly this, shows aging that exceeds time, shows consumption, shows the visible cost of 4 years that were not ordinary years, that were war years. That were years of sleeplessness and burden and grief and responsibility that no human system was designed to carry. The photographs document what words might deny, document that the war killed Lincoln slowly before it killed him suddenly, that the burden destroyed him gradually before assassination destroyed him completely. The first photograph, 1861, shows a man who looks his age, shows someone who carries melancholy. The sadness is visible, the weight is apparent. But the face is relatively intact, has structure, has flesh covering bone, has eyes that look directly at camera with awareness that does not yet include absolute exhaustion, has mouth that can still smile even if smiles come rarely, has the face of someone who has known suffering but has not yet been consumed by it, has integrity still, has boundary between self and suffering, has not yet dissolved into the burden. This is Lincoln before the war becomes what it becomes. Before the casualties exceed imagination, before Antietam and Gettysburg and all the battles that will turn names of small towns into synonyms for mass death. This is the last photograph of Lincoln before Lincoln becomes what he will become. the last image of the man before the man is transformed into monument built of suffering, into testimony to what burden can do to flesh, to face, to the visible surface of consciousness that carries too much. The progression through photographs shows the stages. Shows the gradual wearing away. Each photograph is dated. Each can be placed in sequence. Each shows Lincoln at specific moment in specific month of specific year, and together they create time-lapse, create documentation of deterioration, create record that would be impossible to deny even if denial were attempted. The face changes month by month, year by year. The changes are not subtle, are not minor variations in expression or lighting, are fundamental alterations to structure, to appearance. To what the face conveys, the cheeks hollow. This is one of the first visible changes. The flesh that covered the bones begins receding, begins leaving the skull more visible, more prominent. The face begins looking gaunt, begins looking malnourished though he ate, begins looking like someone wasting from illness though the illness was not physical, was not disease that could be treated with medicine, was the disease of responsibility, the disease of grief. The disease of sending thousands to die while being unable to die yourself. The disease of surviving while others did not. The cheeks hollow and the face becomes skull-like, becomes memento mori, becomes reminder that flesh is temporary, that bodies fail, that consumption occurs not just through illness but through suffering that exceeds what flesh can endure while remaining intact. The eyes recede, sink deeper into their sockets, the orbital bones become more prominent, the eyes themselves seem to retreat. Withdraw from contact, to look from greater distance even though the physical distance remains unchanged. The eyes in early photographs engage with camera, meet it, acknowledge it, but in later photographs the eyes look through the camera, look past it, look towards something beyond the frame, beyond the moment, beyond what can be captured in photograph. The eyes have seen too much, have witnessed too much death, have read too many telegrams announcing casualties, have reviewed too many letters from grieving mothers, have watched too many young men march away knowing many would not return. The eyes that have seen this cannot see normally anymore, cannot engage with surface reality, are looking always at what lies beneath, at what hovers around, at the death that surrounds life during wartime, at the grief that waits behind every smile, at the cost that every decision carries. The lines deepen, around eyes, around mouth, across forehead. The lines are not gentle signs of aging, are not laugh lines or crow's feet that happy people accumulate, are lines carved by worry, by sleeplessness, by grief expressed and unexpressed, by the constant tension of carrying unbearable burden while attempting to function normally. The lines are wounds almost, are scars that suffering creates on face, are permanent alterations that testimony to what consciousness has endured. Each line tells story. Each crease represents 1,000 nights of inadequate sleep, 1,000 days of decisions that haunt, 1,000 moments of grief that could not be fully expressed. The lines map the suffering, document it, make it visible even when visibility was not chosen, was not wanted, was simply inevitable consequence of carrying such weight for such duration. The hair grays. This is normal aging, is expected, but the graying happens too quickly, too completely. The photographs show dark hair becoming salt and pepper, becoming predominantly gray, show the transformation happening across months rather than years. Show acceleration that suggests stress rather than time, that suggests burden rather than age. The graying is not attractive, is not distinguished, is not the silver that age sometimes brings gracefully, is the gray of exhaustion, of depletion, of vital force being consumed, of whatever animates flesh being slowly drained by demands that exceed what can be supplied without cost. The gray hair testifies, says, this person is being used up, is being consumed, is giving more than can be given while remaining whole. The gray spreads, takes over, makes the face look older than years justify, makes Lincoln look ancient when he is barely middle-aged. The posture changes. The photographs show this too, show the way he sits, the way he holds his body. In early photographs, the posture is upright, is controlled, shows dignity even while showing sorrow. But later photographs show slumping, show shoulders curving forward, show the body folding around the burden it carries. Show exhaustion so complete that maintaining upright posture requires more effort than remains available. The body wants to collapse, wants to fold, wants to stop holding itself against gravity. The photographs capture moments when the effort to remain upright is visible, when the body's desire to fall is barely restrained, when consciousness maintains control but just barely, just enough to sit for the photograph, just enough to be documented. But the strain shows, the cost shows, the exhaustion shows. Some believe the photographs show more than physical aging, show spiritual exhaustion, show the consumption not just of body but of soul, show what happens when the burden of responsibility becomes so heavy that it begins destroying the person who carries it. The photographs become metaphysical testimony, become evidence of suffering that exceeds the merely physical, that touches whatever we are beyond flesh, beyond brain function, beyond the mechanistic processes that keep bodies alive. The photographs show someone being unmade, being deconstructed, being reduced from full person to something less, to someone whose existence has narrowed to bearing burden, whose identity has contracted to carrying responsibility, whose self has dissolved into duty. The photographs document this spiritual death, this dissolution of person into role, this consumption of individual by office. The face in 1865 is barely recognizable as the face in 1861. Not because 4 years have passed, but because 4 years have destroyed, have consumed, have taken from Lincoln something essential, something that made him fully human rather than monument built of suffering. The photographs preserved this process, made it visible, made it undeniable, made it part of the historical record that Lincoln's presidency cost him not just sleep, not just peace, but something more fundamental, cost him himself, the face that aged before the camera's eye. Transformation documented, the consumption made visible, the cost recorded, forever in photographs that show what words might deny, what performance might conceal, what the official record might obscure. The camera saw, the camera captured, the camera preserved, and what remains is testimony, is evidence, is documentation of what burden did, what suffering created, what responsibility cost, the face, the aging, the transformation, all visible, all preserved, all testifying, forever. April 14, 1865. Good Friday, the war was ending. Lee had surrendered 5 days earlier at Appomattox. The Confederate armies were dissolving. The fighting that had consumed 4 years was finally stopping. The Union was preserved. The terrible cost had purchased something. The burden was lifting. Lincoln could imagine a future that included something other than war, could consider what peace would mean, what reconstruction would require, how to heal a nation that had torn itself apart. The weight was not gone, would never be gone completely, but it was lighter, was becoming bearable, was allowing space for something other than constant grief. For the first time in 4 years, Lincoln was seen smiling, was heard laughing, was observed experiencing something approaching joy. The darkness had not lifted, the melancholy remained, but the acute crisis was ending. The war that had made his darkness seem prophetically appropriate was concluding. Perhaps rest might be possible. Perhaps sleep might return. Perhaps the burden that had made rest impossible might release him enough that consciousness could resume normal rhythms, could know again the mercy of surrendering to sleep, could experience again the restoration that proper rest provides. He decided to go to the theater. This was not unusual. Lincoln enjoyed theater, found in performances temporary escape from responsibility, found in watching actors inhabit different lives brief respite from inhabiting his own. Found in stories told on stage distraction from the story he was living. Theater was pleasure, was recreation, was one of the few things that brought him something like happiness. Mary wanted to go, wanted evening together, wanted to enjoy the peace that Lee's surrender had created, wanted to celebrate, wanted normal evening, normal pleasure, normal life after 4 years of nothing normal. So they made plans, sent word that they would attend Ford's Theater, would watch Our American Cousin, would sit in the presidential box, would be seen by the audience, would participate in public celebration of war's ending, would be president and first lady enjoying performance like ordinary citizens might enjoy performance. The plans were made, the evening was anticipated, the box was decorated, flags were hung, the scene was set. The box at Ford's Theater was elevated, was positioned where stage was visible and where occupants were visible to audience, was designed for being seen. For displaying, for making presidential presence part of the evening's performance. The box was not particularly secure, was accessible through corridor, was guarded but not heavily, security was assumed, was taken for granted. The idea that someone would enter, would attack, would kill in such public setting seemed unlikely, seemed almost impossible. Assassination attempts had occurred elsewhere, on lonely roads, in isolated moments, but not in crowded theater, not during performance. Not in box surrounded by citizens. The security was inadequate, the guard was insufficient, the door was not locked, the access was too easy, but none of this was apparent. None of this seemed concerning. The evening proceeded as planned. The danger remained invisible, remained unacknowledged, remained waiting. The performance began, the play unfolded. Lincoln watched, enjoyed what he was watching, laughed at the comedy, responded to the drama, participated in the performance by being audience. By allowing the play to occupy his attention, to distract him from the constant background of responsibility that never fully receded, the evening was pleasant, was what they had hoped, was normal in ways that 4 years had made impossible. Mary sat beside him, held his hand, enjoyed his company, enjoyed seeing him relaxed, seeing him present, seeing him engaged with something other than war, other than burden, other than the weight that had defined every moment for so long. The evening was gift. Respite was the peace that they had earned, that the nation had earned, that the terrible cost had purchased. They sat in the box, they watched the play, they were happy, briefly, temporary lie, in the moment before the moment ended. And then John Wilkes Booth entered the box through door that should have been guarded, that should have been locked, that should have prevented access, entered carrying pistol, carrying knife, carrying intention to kill, carrying belief that killing Lincoln would somehow undo surrender, would somehow restore Confederacy, would somehow change what had been decided on battlefields across 4 years. Booth entered. Lincoln's back was to the door, was to the entrance, was vulnerable, was unprotected, was presented as target without awareness that he was target. Booth raised the pistol, aimed, fired, single shot, behind the ear. The bullet entered Lincoln's skull, entered brain, created damage that was immediately catastrophic, immediately fatal even though death would take hours. The consciousness that had been wakeful for so long was destroyed in that instant. Not ended yet, the body would continue, would breathe for hours more, but consciousness was gone, was obliterated by bullets' passage through brain, was ended before Lincoln could know what was happening, before awareness could register, before pain could be felt. The ending was immediate, was complete. Was sudden in ways that after 4 years of slow suffering seemed almost merciful in its speed even while being absolute tragedy in its violence. He slumped forward, the body responding to destroyed consciousness, the loss of control that brain injury creates. Mary screamed, realized what had happened, realized her husband was shot, was dying, was being taken from her. Others in the box moved toward him, tried to help, tried to support the body that was collapsing. Tried to do something when nothing could be done. Booth jumped from box to stage, shouted his declaration, his Latin phrase that meant nothing, that changed nothing, that was theatrical gesture and moment that transcended theater. Booth fled, escaped through backstage, disappeared into night, left behind chaos, left behind dying president, left behind the catastrophe he had created, left behind the ending he had caused. They carried Lincoln from the theater, could not leave him there. Could not let him die in the box in front of audience, needed to move him, to take him somewhere private, somewhere dignified, somewhere appropriate for dying. Peterson House across the street had room available. Boarding house, not presidential, not official, just available, just close, just possible in moment when possibility was what mattered. They carried him across the street, carried him upstairs, brought him to small room, placed him on bed that was too short for his height. Positioned him diagonally so he would fit. The indignity of it, the ordinary domestic space becoming site of national tragedy. The small room, the inadequate bed, the space not chosen for appropriateness but simply for availability, for proximity, for being there when there was needed. The back brace was still in place. This detail would be discovered later. The steel frame that had held him upright through 4 years, that had maintained posture when posture was performance. That had kept him rigid through countless hours of standing and sitting and enduring. The brace had held him upright after the first shot. After the bullet entered, after consciousness ended, the body should have collapsed, should have slumped, should have fallen forward, but the brace held him, kept him vertical, kept him visible, kept him positioned for the second shot if second shot had been needed. The brace that had enabled him, that had allowed the performance, that had been essential to functioning. That brace also made him vulnerable, made escape impossible, made the assassination possible in ways it might not have been if his body had been free to respond naturally. To fall, to be protected by the car's structure. The irony is terrible. The device that helped him also helped kill him. The steel that held him together could not protect him, could only hold him in death's path. The brace was removed at Peterson House, was taken off the body that no longer needed it. No longer required its support, no longer performed. The brace was set aside, and Lincoln's body was finally released from the architecture that had held it, finally allowed to rest without steel, without structure, without the frame that had made functioning possible. The body lay without the brace, and perhaps this was the first genuine rest in years, the first time the spine was supported only by bed, only by surface beneath rather than frame surrounding. The first time in years that the body was free of the steel, was allowed to simply be, was not held rigid, was not forced into position, was released, even in dying, even in the terrible ending. This small release, this small mercy, the body free of the brace, the rest finally coming, not as desired, not as deserved, but coming. The box at Ford's Theater was the place where the burden was set down, where the vigilance ended, where the walking stopped, where the sleepless nights ceased. Where Lincoln's long suffering was concluded, not by healing, not by peace earned, but by violence that ended everything. That stopped the suffering by stopping the sufferer. That brought rest by bringing death. The box remains, is preserved, is memorial, is the space that holds memory of what occurred there. Visitors come, stand where he sat, look towards stage he watched, try to imagine the moment, try to understand, try to feel, but the box is empty now, holds only absence, only memory. Only the knowledge that here, in this small space above a theater, Abraham Lincoln's vigil ended. His burden was released, his suffering ceased, the box, the space, the memorial, all testifying to ending, to cessation, to the moment when consciousness that had persisted beyond what seemed possible finally stopped. The box at Ford's Theater, where rest came too late, where rest came too violently, where rest came anyway, finally, absolutely, forever. Continue with chapters 810. Let me know if you'd like me to complete the remaining chapters. They carried him across the street, from Ford's Theater to the Peterson House, to the boarding house where a room was available, where a bed could hold him through the long hours of dying. The journey was brief, was measured in steps rather than blocks, but it marked transition, from public space to private, from theater to bedroom, from performance to the final, intimate struggle between life and death. The people who carried him were careful, were gentle despite urgency. We're trying to preserve dignity even as catastrophe unfolded. We're trying to treat the dying president with respect even as his blood stained their hands and clothes. We're trying to do something when doing seemed futile, when the wound was clearly mortal, when the bullet's passage through brain meant that survival was impossible. But they carried him anyway, did what could be done, brought him to the room where he would die. The room was small, was plainly furnished. Was bedroom and boarding house that served travelers and temporary residents. Was not presidential, was not designed for state occasions or historical moments. Was simply room, simple space, 4 walls and a bed and the basic furniture that such rooms contained. The bed was too short, this became immediately apparent. Lincoln's body would not fit, was too tall for normal bed, required diagonal positioning. Required that his legs extend beyond the mattress edge or that his head press against headboard. They chose diagonal, placed him angled across the bed so his length could be accommodated. The indignity of this was noted by witnesses, was recorded in their accounts, was part of the testimony about how ordinary the space was, how inadequate for what was occurring, how a president deserved better setting for dying than cramped boarding house room with bed that could not properly hold him. But the room was what was available, was what proximity provided, was close enough to reach quickly, was private enough for dying, was sheltered enough that the president's final hours would not be public spectacle, would not be performed before audience, would allow some dignity even if the setting was undignified. The room would serve, would hold what it needed to hold, would witness what it needed to witness, would become the place where Lincoln's story concluded. Where consciousness that had been damaged by bullet finally ceased, where the body that had carried such burden finally stopped functioning. The room was not chosen, was not anticipated, was simply there when there was needed, and so it became sacred through use, through what occurred within its walls, through being the space that held Lincoln's dying. The vigil began immediately. Doctors were summoned, family was notified, cabinet members arrived. Government officials gathered in rooms too small to hold everyone who came. The Peterson house filled with mourners, with witnesses, with people who understood that history was occurring, that the president was dying, that the nation was losing its leader in moment of transition from war to peace, that Lincoln would not survive to guide Reconstruction, would not finish what he had started, would not see the healing he had hoped to oversee. The vigil was partly medical. Doctors examined the wound. Determined it was mortal, understood that nothing could be done, that the bullet had destroyed too much brain, that consciousness would not return, that death was certain. The only question was timing. The only uncertainty was how many hours the body would persist in breathing, would continue its automatic functions, would maintain life in purely biological sense even though Lincoln himself was already gone, already beyond reach. Already in whatever state consciousness enters when brain can no longer support it. Mary came, was brought to the room, saw her husband dying, saw the wound, saw the doctors' faces, understood immediately that no hope remained. Her grief was profound, was overwhelming, filled the small room with sound of weeping, with expressions of loss that witnesses found difficult to bear. She was led away sometimes, given respite in other rooms, then would return, would sit beside the bed, would hold his hand. Would speak to him even though he could not hear, could not respond, could not acknowledge her presence. She spoke anyway, spoke as if he might hear, as if consciousness might somehow persist even though brain was destroyed, as if love might reach him even though medical science said reaching was impossible. She spoke her grief, her love, her anguish, her inability to accept what was happening, her desperate hope that somehow he would wake, would respond, would return to her. The hope was futile. But hope persisted anyway, persisted through hours of vigil, through night that seemed endless, through waiting that brought no change except gradual weakening, gradual approach of final ending. Robert came, Lincoln's son, came to witness his father's dying, to be present in final hours, to hold vigil as son should hold vigil. Robert's grief was quieter than Mary's, was more contained, was expressed through presence rather than words, through standing witness, through being there. Through maintaining composure while internally experiencing devastation. The relationship between them had been complicated, had been distant sometimes, had been formal in ways that Victorian fatherhood created, but the love was present, was real, was evident in Robert's face as he stood by the bed, as he watched his father's breathing grow shallower, as he recognized that ending was approaching, that the father who had been giant in his life was dying, was becoming memory. Was passing from present to past, from life to history. Robert stood, watched, waited, bore witness to ending he could not prevent, could not change, could only acknowledge and carry forward. Whispers tell us that cabinet members held conference in other rooms while Lincoln lay dying, that government business could not stop even for president's death, that succession had to be managed, that Vice President Johnson needed to be located and prepared to take oath. That continuity of government required attention even while grief demanded acknowledgement. Stanton managed this. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took charge, coordinated response, made arrangements, ensured that government would continue functioning, that Lincoln's death would not create chaos, would not paralyze administration, would not prevent necessary work from continuing. Stanton's efficiency was remarkable, was testimony to his competence. But it was also perhaps defense against grief, against the enormity of what was happening, against the loss of the president he had served, had quarreled with, had respected deeply despite disagreements. Stanton worked through the night, worked while Lincoln died, worked because work was what remained, was what could be controlled, was response that made sense when grief made no sense, when loss was too large to process, when the mind needed occupation to avoid being overwhelmed by feeling. The breathing changed as hours passed, became more labored, more irregular. The body was failing. The biological processes that maintain life were shutting down. The brain damage had initiated cascade of failures, of systems ceasing function, of the body slowly releasing its hold on existence. The doctors monitored, measured pulse that grew weaker, noted breathing that grew shallower, documented the progression toward death that was inevitable, that no intervention could prevent. That could only be witnessed and recorded. The medical details were clinical, were factual, were the objective observation of dying process. But beneath the clinical observations was human recognition, was awareness that this was not simply body failing, was person ending, was consciousness however damaged, however unreachable approaching its final moment, was Lincoln dying, was the man who had led through war dying in small room in boarding house. Was tragedy occurring despite the clinical language used to describe it? Dawn approached. Light touched windows. The night that had seemed endless was ending, but not for Lincoln. His night would not end in dawn, would not conclude in return to consciousness, would not transition from darkness to light, would end only in deeper darkness, in final cessation, in the moment when breathing stopped and did not resume, when the body that had struggled through night finally stopped struggling. When life that had been damaged beyond repair was finally released, the light grew stronger. Morning came for the city, for the nation, for the mourners gathered in the Peterson house, but not for Lincoln. His morning never came. His night extended into permanent night. His vigil ended not in waking but in sleep that had no waking, in rest that had no rising, in silence that had no sound. The moment came at 7:22 a.m., the specific time recorded by witnesses, preserved in accounts. Made part of historical record. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's breathing stopped. His pulse ceased. His body released its final hold on life. The doctors confirmed death, performed the observations that made death official, that transformed dying into dead, that marked transition from person who was ending to person who had ended. Stanton spoke words that witnesses remembered, that entered historical record. That became part of how the moment was remembered. He said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The pronouncement recognized transition, recognized that Lincoln was no longer their president, their leader, their contemporary, was now historical figure, was now memory, was now story that would be told and retold, was now belonging not to present but to history, to the ages that would study him, remember him, try to understand him. The moment of death was moment of transformation. From living man to historical figure, from suffering person to martyred saint, from human who struggled to symbol that represented larger meanings, the transformation was immediate, was complete, was irreversible. They prepared the body, washed it, dressed it in clean clothes, made it presentable for the viewing that would come, for the lying in state, for the public mourning, for the rituals that death requires. The preparation was tender, was done with care. Was final service that living could offer to dead. The body was no longer Lincoln in some essential sense. The consciousness that had made the body Lincoln was gone. What remained was vessel, was flesh that had once housed person, was form that resembled Lincoln but was not Lincoln, was simply remains, but the remains were treated with respect, with reverence, with recognition that this body had belonged to someone important, someone who had mattered. Someone whose death was not simply personal loss but national catastrophe. The room became memorial, became the place where Lincoln died, became part of historical record, became site that would be preserved, that would be visited, that would hold memory of what occurred there. The bed where he lay would become relic, the room would become shrine, the boarding house would become museum, all preserving memory of the night when morning never came, when Lincoln's vigil ended, when his suffering ceased. When consciousness that had been wakeful for so long finally found rest, not the rest he had sought, not the gentle release into sleep, not the restorative unconsciousness that he had been denied for so long, but permanent rest, absolute rest, rest beyond waking. The room held him through the transition, held his dying, held the witnesses, held the grief, held the ending, and now holds memory, holds the knowledge that here, in this small space, Abraham Lincoln died. The sleepless president finally stopped watching, finally stopped bearing, finally stopped enduring. The room where morning never came, where night extended into permanent night, where Lincoln's story ended, where consciousness ceased, where rest arrived as death. The room remains, preserved, memorial, testimony to ending, to loss, to the mourning that came for everyone except the one who needed it most. The room, the vigil, the ending, all held in memory, all preserved. All testifying to what occurred when Lincoln's long night finally ended, not in dawn, not in waking, but in silence, in stillness, in rest, forever. What remains now is story, is accumulated testimony of those who knew him, who witnessed his sleeplessness and his sorrow, who stood with him through war years, who watched his face age in photographs, who heard his dreams and read his letters and understood perhaps not fully, perhaps not completely, but enough what he carried, what he endured, what the presidency cost him beyond the ultimate cost that came in Ford's theater. The story has been told and retold. Has been examined by historians who parse documents and letters and testimony looking for understanding. Has been studied by psychologists who diagnose across centuries using imperfect evidence filtered through cultural assumptions. Has been contemplated by anyone who wonders what it means to lead during crisis, what it costs to make decisions that determine life and death, what happens to consciousness when responsibility exceeds human capacity but must be carried by humans anyway. The story persists because the story matters, because Lincoln's suffering illuminates something about leadership and burden and the price of greatness that cannot be learned except through studying those who paid that price. It is said that Lincoln's melancholy was never hidden as completely as Kennedy's illness would be, that those who knew Lincoln spoke openly of his darkness, of his constitutional sadness, of the weight that seemed always to press on him, of the nights when he could not sleep, of the mornings when exhaustion was visible despite his efforts to conceal it, of the burden that was apparent in how he moved, how he spoke, how he carried himself through rooms as if gravity pulled harder on him than on others. The melancholy was part of his public image even during his lifetime, was acknowledged, was discussed, was known to be part of who he was. This openness is striking, is different from how later presidents would guard their suffering, would conceal their vulnerabilities, would maintain performances of strength that denied any weakness. Lincoln's era permitted acknowledgement that modern era seems to forbid, permitted seeing leaders as humans who suffered, who struggled, who bore burdens that caused visible damage. The accounts of those who knew him are consistent, remarkably consistent given that they come from different people observing at different times in different contexts. His secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay wrote of his sleeplessness, finding him awake at all hours, of his nocturnal walks to the telegraph office, of his inability to rest even when rest was desperately needed. His friend Joshua Speed spoke of the darkness that had shadowed Lincoln since youth, of the times when melancholy became so severe that suicide seemed possible, of the need to watch him, to be present, to keep him connected to life when his own connection felt tenuous. His wife Mary spoke after his death in her own declining years of his troubled sleep, of his nightmares, of his premonitions, of the burden that he carried through their years in Washington, of how the war consumed him, changed him, aged him beyond his years. Cabinet members noted his exhaustion, his tendency to fall silent in meetings, to drift away mentally even while physically present, to emerge from these absences looking more tired than before, looking as if the internal journey had been more exhausting than the meeting itself. They noted his humor too, the jokes and stories that would erupt suddenly, that seemed to come from nowhere, that broke tension but also suggested someone working hard to create lightness because lightness did not come naturally, because darkness was the default state and light had to be generated deliberately. The humor was defense mechanism, was survival strategy, was way of managing depression that might otherwise be overwhelming. The stories served function beyond entertainment, served to maintain his own equilibrium, to keep the darkness at bay, to create moments of reprieve from the weight that never fully lifted. Whispers tell us that the photographs became testimony after death, that people looked at images taken across 4 years and saw documented what words had tried to describe, saw the visible aging, the hollowing of the face, the deepening of lines, the retreat of the eyes into shadow, the transformation that war had created. The photographs made the cost undeniable, made the suffering visible, made clear that Lincoln had been consumed by what he endured, that the presidency had destroyed him slowly before assassination destroyed him suddenly. The photographs became evidence, became part of how his story was told, became visual testimony that supplemented and confirmed the verbal testimony of those who had witnessed his suffering directly. The medical records that existed were limited. Lincoln's era did not document health as thoroughly as later eras would, did not create the detailed medical histories that would become standard. But what records exist mention his melancholy, mention the intestinal troubles that were likely stress-related, mention the weight loss, mention the chronic fatigue, mention symptoms that modern diagnosis might call depression, might recognize as physical manifestations of psychological burden. The limited records still testify, still add to accumulated evidence that Lincoln was not well, was suffering, was being damaged by what he carried. The story that emerges from all these sources is consistent, is coherent, is testimony to suffering that was profound and persistent. Lincoln suffered from constitutional melancholy that predated his presidency, suffered from sleeplessness that intensified during war years, suffered from burden of responsibility that manifested as physical deterioration, suffered from guilt of surviving while others died, suffered from having to make decisions that determined fates of hundreds of thousands, suffered from witnessing war's cost while being unable to end that cost except by continuing the war that created it. The suffering was not occasional, was not temporary, was constant, was defining feature of his existence during presidency. Was the reality beneath the performance? Was the human truth beneath the historical role? Some believe Lincoln's suffering made him better president, made him more empathetic, more patient, more capable of bearing what needed bearing. This interpretation sees the melancholy as strange gift, as preparation that enabled rather than disability that prevented. The depression that made ordinary happiness difficult made extraordinary endurance possible. Made him capable of functioning while suffering in ways that those who had never known such darkness could not access. Made him able to bear burdens that would break others because he had been practicing bearing unbearable things since youth. The melancholy was crucible, was forge, was the fire that tempered him into person capable of leading through nation's darkest hour. This view honors his suffering by suggesting it served purpose, by suggesting it was not meaningless, by suggesting that perhaps he was exactly right person for this impossible moment because his temperament matched the moment's demands. Others see the suffering as simply tragic, as cost that should not have been required, as damage that diminished rather than enabled, as evidence that we ask too much of leaders, that we demand they transcend human limitation, that we require them to function beyond human capacity, that we destroy them through the burdens we place on them. This view sees Lincoln's suffering as warning, as testimony to cruelty of leadership during crisis, as evidence that the price is too high, that we should not require such sacrifice, that systems should be built that distribute burden rather than concentrating it, that protect those who lead rather than consuming them. The suffering becomes indictment, becomes call for change, becomes reminder that humans have limits, and exceeding those limits creates damage that matters morally even when it serves practical purposes. The truth perhaps includes both perspectives. Perhaps Lincoln's suffering enabled his leadership and was tragic cost. Perhaps both things are true simultaneously. Perhaps the melancholy that made him capable also made him miserable. Perhaps the burden that he bore effectively also destroyed him. Perhaps the presidency that saved Union also killed its president. Both things can be true. Both things can matter. Both things can be honored and lamented simultaneously. The story holds contradiction, holds complexity, holds the recognition that Lincoln's presidency was triumph and tragedy, was achievement and cost, was service and sacrifice, was all these things together without resolution into simpler truth. What remains certain is that Lincoln suffered visibly, suffered documentably, suffered in ways that those who witnessed tried to ease but could not eliminate, could not remove, could only witness and record and carry forward into memory. The suffering is part of who he was, part of how we understand him, part of what his example teaches, about leadership, about burden, about the cost of doing great things, about what humans can endure when endurance becomes necessary, about the gap between public performance and private pain, about all the ways that serving others can destroy the one who serves while the service still matters, still achieves, still creates outcomes that justify the cost even while the cost remains tragic. The melancholy became memory, became part of historical record, became testimony that persists, that future generations study, that continues teaching, that illuminates not just Lincoln's experience but human experience, the capacity for suffering, the ability to endure. The continuation despite darkness, the functioning while broken, all the contradictions that make us human, that make us capable of more than we imagine while being more fragile than we pretend. Lincoln's melancholy is not footnote to his greatness, is not peripheral detail, is central truth, is part of the story that must be told if the story is to be honest, is to be complete, is to honor him fully rather than only partially. The melancholy that knew no dawn, that became memory, that persists in testimony, that teaches still what it taught then, about darkness, about endurance, about the cost, about the burden, about all that Lincoln carried, all that he bore, all that he sacrificed. The story continues, the memory persists, and Lincoln, who walked with shadows, who could not sleep, who aged before cameras, who died before his work was finished. Lincoln remains in memory, remains in story, remains in the testimony of suffering that illuminates, that teaches, that honors. Forever. After everything, after the assassination and the mourning, after the funeral train carried his body home to Illinois, after the nation grieved and buried and began attempting to continue without him, after the immediate shock settled into long grief, after history began its work of interpretation and analysis and attempting to understand what happened and what it meant, after all of this, after the story was told and retold. After the accounts were written and the photographs were studied and the testimony was gathered. After Lincoln became not just memory but myth, not just man but monument, not just president but symbol. After all of this, what remains? What persists beyond the facts and dates and documented events? What truth survives the transformation from lived experience to historical narrative? What remains is the question that Lincoln's life and death pose. The question that his suffering illuminates, the question that his example forces us to confront whether we want to or not. The question is simple to state and impossible to answer. What do we owe those who lead us? What do we owe those who accept burden that exceeds human capacity? What do we owe those who function while suffering, who serve while being destroyed by service, who carry responsibilities that crush them while carrying? What do we owe them? The question has no single answer. Has no response that satisfies everyone, has no solution that resolves the tension. But the question persists, demands attention, requires wrestling even when wrestling produces no resolution. The question matters because Lincoln matters, because his suffering matters, because understanding what leadership cost him might change how we think about leadership, about what we ask of those who govern, about what we should expect, about what is reasonable and what is exploitation, about where the boundary lies between necessary burden and unnecessary damage. It is said that different eras have answered the question differently, that the way we think about leadership's costs has changed, has evolved, has shifted based on our understanding of human psychology and our awareness of mental health and our recognition that people have limits that should be respected rather than exceeded. Lincoln's era believed that suffering built character, that hardship created strength, that bearing unbearable things was virtue, was proof of worth, was demonstration of fitness for leadership. This view had limited sympathy for those who broke under burden, had limited patience for those who admitted they were struggling, expected men, especially men in positions of authority, to endure silently, to maintain performance regardless of private cost, to sacrifice themselves for public good without complaint. This view saw Lincoln's suffering and said, "This is what leadership requires. This is the price. This is appropriate cost of serving in highest office during national crisis." Later eras developed different views, developed awareness that suffering beyond certain thresholds creates damage that matters morally, that we should not require people to destroy themselves, that systems can be built to distribute burden, that leadership can be structured to prevent any single person from carrying weight that exceeds human capacity. These views look at Lincoln's suffering and see warning. See evidence of system failure, see proof that something was wrong with how leadership was structured, how burden was concentrated, how responsibility was managed. These views do not blame Lincoln for suffering. Blame instead the structures that made suffering inevitable, the systems that concentrated power and therefore concentrated burden, the assumptions that presidents must be superhuman rather than human, must transcend limitation rather than acknowledge it. These views call for change, for reform, for restructuring how leadership works so that future leaders are protected rather than consumed. Whispers tell us that the question becomes more urgent as we learn more about mental health, as we develop language for depression and anxiety and trauma and all the ways that consciousness can suffer, as we recognize that mental health matters as much as physical health, that psychological damage is real damage, that emotional suffering is genuine suffering. This knowledge makes Lincoln's melancholy more visible, more understandable, more diagnosable. We can say now with confidence what his era could only describe vaguely. Lincoln suffered from clinical depression, suffered from what we would recognize as major depressive disorder, suffered in ways that modern medicine could treat, modern therapy could help, modern understanding could frame differently than his era framed it. This knowledge changes how we see his story. Makes us wonder what might have been different if he had lived in an era that understood mental health, that had treatments available, that did not require silent suffering, that allowed acknowledgement without shame. Would treatment have helped? Would therapy have changed his experience? Would medication have eased the melancholy? We cannot know, can only speculate, can only recognize that he suffered without access to interventions that might have helped. That he bore his depression alone in ways that no one should have to bear such burden alone. But perhaps there is danger in imposing modern frameworks too completely. Perhaps we risk losing something if we see Lincoln only through lens of mental illness, only as patient who needed treatment, only as person suffering from diagnosable condition. Perhaps this reduces him, simplifies him, misses something essential about how his melancholy and his greatness were intertwined. How the same temperament that made him suffer also made him capable. How the depression that made ordinary life difficult made extraordinary achievement possible. How he was not simply victim of his darkness, but someone who learned to function with it, to work through it, to lead despite it, to become who he became not by overcoming the melancholy but by incorporating it, by making it part of who he was rather than something to be eliminated or cured. The question remains, what do we owe? And the answer perhaps is, we owe acknowledgement, we owe recognition, we owe the honesty to see both the achievement and the cost, to honor the leadership without denying the suffering, to remember the greatness without forgetting the price. We owe Lincoln the full truth of his story, not just the monument, not just the marble figure seated in memorial, not just the emancipator or the savior of union or any of the simplified versions that make him symbol rather than person. We owe him the recognition that he was human, that he suffered, that the suffering mattered even while the achievement mattered, that both truths can be held simultaneously, that honoring him means honoring all of him, the darkness and the light, the melancholy and the humor, the suffering and the endurance, all of it together, all of it real, all of it part of who he was. We owe also obligation to learn, to take from his example not just inspiration but caution. To recognize that asking humans to exceed their capacity creates damage, that leadership structured to consume those who lead is leadership structured badly, that we should do better, should create systems that protect, that distribute burden, that recognize human limitation and work within it rather than demanding transcendence. Lincoln's suffering teaches that heroic endurance is possible, but it teaches also that heroic endurance should not be required. That we can admire his achievement while working to ensure future leaders do not have to pay the same price, can honor his sacrifice while trying to make such sacrifice unnecessary. The silence that holds the question is not empty silence, is not absence, is the silence of contemplation, of wrestling with complexity that resists easy answers, of sitting with contradiction that cannot be resolved into simple truth. The silence is full, is pregnant with meaning that cannot be fully expressed in words. Lincoln's story raises questions that philosophy has wrestled with for millennia, questions about suffering and meaning, about cost and achievement, about whether great things can be accomplished without great sacrifice, about whether the price is ever justified or whether some costs are too high regardless of what they purchase. The silence holds these questions, keeps them present, keeps them urgent, keeps them demanding attention even when attention produces no resolution. Perhaps the silence itself is the answer. Perhaps the question is more important than any answer. Perhaps sitting with the uncertainty, sitting with the complexity, sitting with the recognition that Lincoln's story contains truths that contradict each other and are all true simultaneously. Perhaps this sitting is what we owe, this willingness to hold paradox, this refusal to simplify. This commitment to seeing fully even when full seeing is uncomfortable, even when it requires acknowledging our own complicity in systems that consume leaders, even when it demands we change how we think about leadership and burden and what we ask of those who govern. Lincoln rests now in Springfield, has rested for over a century and a half, rests beneath monument, beneath marble, beneath the accumulated weight of historical interpretation and cultural meaning and all the ways that time transforms people into symbols. But beneath the monument is a person who suffered, who walked through darkness, who could not sleep, who aged beyond his years, who died before his work was finished, who carried burdens that crushed him while he carried them. This person deserves remembering, deserves acknowledgement, deserves the full truth of his story told honestly, the suffering and the greatness, the cost and the achievement, the human and the historical, all together, all honored, all remembered. The silence holds the question, will hold it forever perhaps, because the question has no final answer, has only the ongoing work of wrestling with it, of trying to understand, of honoring Lincoln by being honest about what his leadership cost, by learning from his example without requiring future leaders to repeat his suffering, by building systems that protect those who lead while maintaining accountability, by recognizing that serving public good should not require self-destruction, that we can have leadership without exploitation, that we can honor service without demanding sacrifice of those who serve. The question persists, the silence holds it, and we who inherit Lincoln's legacy inherit also the obligation to sit with the question, to wrestle with it, to let it change how we think about leadership, about burden, about what we ask and what we should ask and what we owe to those who answer our asking. The silence, the question, the obligation, all remaining, all demanding attention, all teaching what Lincoln's suffering teaches, about cost, about burden, about the price of greatness, about all that was given, all that was lost, all that remains in memory, forever asking, forever holding, forever the question that has no answer but must be asked, the silence, deep, full, holding, forever. Tonight we have walked with Lincoln through his darkness, through the sleepless nights and melancholic days, through the telegraph office vigils and the weight of 10,000 letters, through the aging visible in photographs and the dreams that spoke of endings, through Ford's Theater and the Peterson House, through all the spaces where his suffering was documented and witnessed and preserved. His story is not just history, is also testimony, is teaching about what leadership can cost, about what humans can endure, about the price of serving during crisis, about all the ways that burden can crush while being carried. May his example teach us. May his suffering not be forgotten. May the questions his life raises continue demanding our attention. Sleep now if sleep comes, rest if rest is possible. And remember that Lincoln sought such rest for years and found it only an ending. Found it only when consciousness could no longer continue. May you find easier rest, gentler sleep. May the darkness hold you kindly. And may you wake renewed, as Lincoln never could, as he never did, but as he would wish for those who remember him. Rest now, the story is complete. The vigil ends, sleep comes, finally, gently, completely, rest.